Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on managing grassland habitat for diverse taxa and stakeholders. I'm Greg Elliott. I provide communication support for the GCPO LCC, and Toby Gray, also with the GCPO, will be co-hosting with me. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, and today we have a decent number of attendees, so we will be conducting the webinar auditorium style, where you will view the presentation and remain muted until the end. We ask that you please take the opportunity throughout the presentation to submit any questions or comments in the question and chat box available on your webinar dashboard. Your questions will be viewable by us, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible during the discussion following the presentation. And any questions that remain unanswered will be addressed subsequent to the webinar. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Connor McGowan, Assistant Unit Leader of the U.S. Geological Survey, Alabama Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. He works largely on quantitative ecology and decisions analysis projects to support science and resource management decision needs. Prior to joining the USGS in 2010, Connor was a postdoc at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center and completed his PhD in Fisheries and Wildlife Sciences at the University of Missouri in 2008. Take it away, Connor.
Hi, everyone. This is Connor. I hope you can hear me. I'm off mute now. I am going to walk through the project that we put together with the support of the GCPO funding from 2 years ago. And I want to acknowledge my collaborators on this project. We had several co-PIs, but I especially want to note Kevin Ryer, who was a master's student that worked in the field and on some of the data analysis, and also my colleague Eric Lonsdorf, who was a collaborator at Franklin Marshall University. He's now with University of Minnesota, but he was a tremendous collaborator on this project. Most of the slides in this presentation are actually their slides from their other presentations or slides that they've made, and I've organized them into the talk that I'm going to give today. So I want to start out with a little bit of exposition and frame the problem that historically in the Southeast, although we're not known as quite the prairie and grassland area as the Midwest is perhaps, or the Great Plains, but there was a very, very significant amount of grassland habitat and prairie habitat throughout the southeastern part of the United States. We have a large area here in the GCPO land area called the Black Belt Prairie. There was prairies down here in Mississippi as well as over in Arkansas. Most of these prairies over the last, well, at that time there was, just for example, 140,000 hectares of prairie right here in central Alabama and eastern Mississippi. Now that's not one contiguous 140,000 hectares. As you might know, there was lots of small patches of prairie interspersed by other habitats, and those prairies were largely maintained through fire. We have seen a massive loss of prairie habitat in the region over the century or two since it's been settled. We have lost greater than 99% of the native prairie habitat in the Black Belt region, just for example. It's mostly happened through land conversion to agriculture or pasture. It's also happened through fire suppression, where red cedar and other tree species have invaded and taken over these habitats so that they're no longer suitable for grassland associated wildlife species. So we began a project with the East Gulf Coastal Plain Joint Venture in 2010, 2011, looking at how we could manage habitats, make decisions about where to put habitat at very large spatial scales to benefit migratory birds, especially to support the Partners in Flight, the nationwide Partners in Flight effort. The core question of that effort was largely focused on what habitat and where to put habitat in order to best benefit those bird populations. That effort relied on assessing what kind of landscape was currently there, building things that we called patch network analysis, looking at the connectivity of patches to each other, and then building occupancy models related to connectivity and existing habitat patches to try and rank habitats or rank patches that might be the best patches for managing and to convert to grassland or to improve or restore as more natural prairie type habitats. So a product of that project may have looked something like this, where we provide a map to decision makers that show the top 10% of pasture patches that would be really useful, or the top 10% that would be best for restoring to non-pasture grasslands to best benefit a long-distance dispersing migratory bird. We envisioned two primary applications of that model and that work that we did with the JV. They focused on proactive decision-making, basically helping managers identify valuable potential habitats and then reaching out to landowners or reaching out to managers of those sites and working with them to restore or improve those sites. So identifying the best sites and then reaching out to the owners of that site to help them with their management. Second would be a reactive, where the model could be used to evaluate things like state wildlife grant applications or CRP applications to identify which of the proposed sites from an RFP would have the best value for grassland birds, and then award those sites the funding. So that was largely the context of the work that was done prior to this GCPO-funded effort. What we are faced with, though, is that habitat conservation decision-making often has multiple objectives, could potentially benefit multiple species, and often has lots of constraining issues and alternative stakeholders or objectives that maybe should be considered as part of these decisions. The work with the JV focused solely on the biological benefit of a habitat and didn't consider multiple species simultaneously. It didn't consider alternative or other objectives that may be important. So the simultaneous assessment of multiple species and the needs of multiple objectives can be a challenging endeavor, both conceptually and computationally, and that became the focus of our current project. We wanted to expand the existing avian-based habitat management modeling to incorporate non-avian focal animal species. And we also wanted to work towards incorporating other objectives like cost or economic considerations into the existing framework to more realistically reflect the decisions and trade-offs that many managers at the state and federal level are faced with when trying to decide about habitat management at landscape scales. So the project from there took two main paths that were complementary, but today I'm presenting them as sequential. And the first part of the seminar today, or the webinar today, is going to focus on the field studies that we did to try and gather empirical data on non-bird, non-avian animal occupancy in early successional grassland type habitats. And then the second part of the talk focuses on a marginal value approach to assessing habitat patches and incorporating additional objectives into that valuation process. So the first part of this talk is largely, as I said, largely taken from Kevin Ryer, my master's student's field research into small mammal and snake and lizard occupancy in grassland habitats. And credit where credit's due, this photo in the background of all my slides, and the main picture here is Kevin's photo from one of his field sites that he studied. So the goals of Kevin's project fit nicely into the larger goals of our research project for the GCPO. We first needed to gather some data on the non-avian species, and these were some of the core questions that Kevin asked in his research. How does the amount of grassland in the landscape of the surrounding a patch affect the occupancy of those grassland-associated species at that patch? How does the amount of forest in the landscape in the area or in the landscape affect occupancy? So is that a negative effect on occupancy? How does fine scale vegetation affect and influence occupancy? And how does connectivity amongst grassland patches influence occupancy? And so Kevin designed a field study. He selected a number of field sites to travel to, and he set up 2 types of surveys at those sites to try and develop occupancy, presence-absence data sets. The first was a visual encounter surveys where he had 50 by 50 meter plots, and he walked every 5 meters. He walked the length of those 50 meter plots, searching for evidence of small mammals or lizards and snakes and other herp species. We also used track tubes at sites to help improve detection of small mammals at those sites. This is a depiction of the track tube. It's about 5 inches high, it's about 4 inches wide, and it's about 12 inches long, with some bait in the center, and the critters would walk across the ink pad and to get to the seed, the sunflower seed in the middle. He did that at 57 sites around, 57 plots around the eastern portion of the GCPO land area in Mississippi and Alabama. And with the data that he collected, he was going to use occupancy modeling in Unmarked, which is a package in R that helps evaluate occupancy data. He evaluated detection on a site-by-site basis using the local vegetation characteristics, and then we evaluated a number of occupancy models with covariates from fine-scale vegetation on up to large, broad-scale habitat proportions in the landscape, as well as this patch connectivity, similar to our work with the JV on the migratory birds. So at those sites, we encountered a number of species. We were targeting species that are listed under the GCPO and the various state wildlife action I'm totally drawing a blank, I'm sorry, and the various states listed as species of conservation concern in either Mississippi or Alabama, or listed as a species of interest / concern by the GCPO. This is what we found when we did those surveys. We found cotton rats, old field mice, we found a lot of raccoons, we found green anoles, very few snakes, and very few amphibians on our surveys. Despite having very sparse data, we forged ahead and did some occupancy analyses to look at potential for landscape scale metrics that would help predict occupancy. We ran a null model as well with these data, and so the fact that these models, even though they don't have a lot of AIC weight, there's a lot of model uncertainty. There is some indication that given that the null model is not receiving support, that some of these covariates may actually be useful predictors of occupancy of old field mice. We did find that woody wetlands at 5 kilometers, so the more woody wetlands you had in a 5-kilometer area, the less likely a site was to be occupied. We found that mixed forests surrounding a site maybe had some positive influence on that occupancy. If we take those results from the top 3 models, this is what we might expect. Large confidence intervals. As I said, there's data were sparse, and so inference is limited and model precision is limited, but we do see a potentially a negative influence of woody wetlands on occupancy and a potentially positive relationship of mixed forest on occupancy at various scales. For the old field mouse, for the hispid cotton rat, we found that model selection was a little more certain, but still quite a bit of uncertainty, and we found actually a positive relationship of woody wetlands with cotton rat occupancy at these sites. So here's a depiction of what those relationships might look like. Again, very broad confidence intervals and limited inferential capacity given the low number of detections. But there is some support for the notion that broad-scale, landscape-scale habitat features might be predictors of occupancy for both these two species. And there is some evidence that fine-scale vegetation might be influential of detection, but not so influential, at least in our studies, of occupancy. Now, again, that's all under the consideration that there were very few detections from these field studies, and perhaps our inferential capacity is not very strong. Before we move on to the next part, I do want to note that we had done very similar studies for songbirds using point counts as part of the JV project, and so we had at our fingertips the ability to use additional bird species as well as the data that we collected in our current study to build the next portion of the modeling that we engaged in. So this is just an example figure from some of the previous research showing that we were able to develop habitat relationships for dickcissels, and so moving forward, we use dickcissels as an example focal species, and we also use the old field mouse as an example focal species. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So we have that's largely the first section of the talk wrapped up and addressed. We can move on now to the second portion of the talk, which is really the management model context. How do we use that empirical data to help inform some decision making? And for this portion of the talk, or of the work, excuse me, we use the sort of intellectual basis that we built for the JV modeling that we'd done previously, and we expanded it and modified it somewhat to improve it for the purposes here. And one of the big changes that we made was to move towards this marginal value assessment of a patch's value. And basically what that does is that we look at the marginal gain in occupancy that occurs at a scale relevant to the analysis. And in this case, just as an example, we did a 1 kilometer, but that buffer or that scale of analysis is relevant to the covariates in the model. So in the next few slides, I'll show an example, and it's a 1 kilometer example because it fits the occupancy analysis that we had. But this spatial scale, this 1 kilometer, you know, as you saw from the previous work, that for an old field mouse, that 1 kilometer becomes a 5 kilometer because the covariates were relevant at that spatial scale. So again, we look at the marginal gain in occupancy that occurs at a scale relevant to the analysis. We essentially determine how a 1 hectare change of habitat would affect occupancy within the entire 1 kilometer surrounding that patch. And so it determines how changing pixel centered at a single pixel in the center would affect the occupancy at that pixel. And then it also looks at the change in occupancy in the surrounding area. The one thing that's important to note is that this is not an effort to maximize the probable occupancy of any new habitat patch that's put on the landscape. Instead, it's focusing on all the changes in occupancy that might occur because of that patch. So not only at the patch that you manage, but also in the landscape that surrounds it, the patches that surround that landscape. What changes in occupancy might we expect to those sites as well? And then we value the change in occupancy instead of the overall occupancy. And so just as an example, this process starts by assessing occupancy in your landscape. And so this is what an occupancy map would look like for the majority of the black belt region for dickcissels, one of the bird species from our previous study. And so red is higher occupancy, white is no occupancy, and then the blue colors indicate relatively lower occupancy probability. And to calculate the marginal gain, what we look at is the expected marginal gain in occupancy by adding a single hectare in relation, this figure here shows in relation to the proportion of grassland. But like I said, what we do then is to take the existing occupancy and look at how changes in specific patches would change the overall occupancy, and then assess the marginal gain across that landscape. So to focus in on just one small patch or one small segment of this giant patch, this giant black belt area, we could look in at this figure here. And so on the figure we have existing grassland patches in black, we have existing pasture patches in gray, and then the white portions are pretty much everything else. The scale from yellow to this maroon or dark brown color is the scale of marginal gain. So darker maroon indicates more valuable, and yellow to white indicates less valuable. And one thing that's interesting to notice is that what we see is that in areas where the proportion of grassland within the 1 kilometer is relatively low, actually gives you the best gain in overall occupancy, or the best marginal gain in occupancy for adding a habitat patch to that area. So when we get out here into areas where there's already lots of grassland on the landscape, adding more grassland doesn't give you very much marginal gain. In areas here where there's already very, very, very low amounts of grassland habitat, we don't expect a lot of benefit of adding. It's here in this low to intermediate area range of existing grasslands that we see the most gain in for adding additional habitats. So this is the point where I had laid out the first question for our participants. And that's a cue for Toby.
Okay, I'm going to launch the poll in the first poll. Can you see the poll on the screen? I guess Connor can't.
Yeah, I can't see any of this, so let me know when we're ready to move on.
It's on the screen, Toby. If everybody could just choose their best answer.
And we're getting some results. I'll leave it up for a little bit more. About 40% of the participants have voted.
That's probably good. We'll take it as an indicator if people don't vote that they just don't have an opinion.
Yeah, I just got another little bump. But right now we're seeing that we're seeing 60% are selecting the first answer, that it contradicts island biogeography theory. 40% selected the second option, 30% the third, and those add up to more than 100% because people are able to select more than one answer. So the most popular theory as to why the approach appears counterintuitive is that it contradicts the island biogeography theory.
Okay, thanks. so it looks like I'm not sure what's going on with my screen.
You should have it back now.
It bumped it out of the presentation mode, and I don't even have a mouse. There you go. I'm sorry. Are my slides up and being viewed?
That's good.
Okay. That was weird, but I think we're back. So I wanted to emphasize that what we end up working with here, or the way this approach is pointing us towards, is that it's looking for sites that would most likely increase the overall occupancy of an area of 1 kilometer, in this particular example at least. And so what that emphasizes to me anyway is that where you have a site with some grassland and some pasture, both of which have some occupancy value to the grassland species that we are interested in, adding new habitat in the proximity of those sites actually increases or has a greater increase in your overall occupancy of that surrounding 1 kilometer than taking a site that is already surrounded by a lot of grassland. So adding a patch of grassland right in here, you would improve the probability of occupancy and improve your occupancy right here. But your occupancy value is already quite high in this region because all of this grassland here is probably already occupied. Whereas at this site here, for example, if this was an ag patch that had a little bit of grassland here and a little bit of pasture there and a little bit of grassland and pasture over here, the ag patch is probably not occupied. And so converting this to some sort of grassland would greatly increase the occupancy probability of this region as a whole, as compared to a site where the occupancy is already quite high. Adding additional habitat here doesn't improve your chances of having this area occupied very much. And that's really the key of the marginal value approach that we're using here. In areas where there's lots of grassland, adding additional grassland doesn't improve your occupancy of that region very much, whereas areas with a little bit of grassland and pasture, adding more grassland habitat has a greater probable benefit to the grassland species in that area. And that's the core of the modeling that we've done. So I want to talk about it in a little bit more detail and hopefully not get too bogged down in some of the equations, but it's really a two-step process that first estimates the occupancy probability at each habitat patch in the landscape, and then calculates the direct gain in occupancy of a parcel, assuming that the site is changing from ag to grassland. And so what we do is we subtract out what changing a site from ag to grassland, what the direct value of that is. And so we have to consider the beta parameter for an agricultural patch, and adding back in the beta times the amount of grassland habitat that you have. So this calculates the direct value of each patch conversion at a site. The next step is to calculate the indirect value of a site, and that is to say, what value does converting a particular site to a better habitat class have on the surrounding habitat patches. So sites that are currently agriculture or pasture or grassland have some occupancy probability, and the occupancy probability of those sites is going to increase or decrease depending on what the surrounding patches are. And so what this second step does is to calculate the benefit of a particular patch conversion to grassland from row crop by subtracting what the value or what the probable occupancy of surrounding patches is, so J, the surrounding patches. So summing up the occupancy of your surrounding patches, which are not your focal patch. If your focal patch was a row crop, you subtract that from what the surrounding occupancy, the sum of the occupancy of the surrounding sites was if your focal patch was actually grassland instead. So the first equation, the D, the direct value, looks at the patch itself and what the change in occupancy is if you convert a specific patch. And then the second step is the I calculation looks at what the effect of your focal patch is on the patches that surround it. And so the restoration value of any given patch, the marginal value of any given patch is simply a function of D times I. Your direct value of that patch times the indirect value of that patch gives you a biological value, I call this, or a conservation value of a particular patch at a site. Now, so far, this only considers the benefit of a single species. So we've looked at a single species, and we've looked at the change in occupancy directly and the change in occupancy indirectly. To incorporate multiple species, we simply need to calculate the direct value and indirect value, and thereby the biological value or the conservation value for each focal species that may or may not be at a site, for each species that we're concerned about. And then we can calculate the sum of the biological value by various means. We could simply add them up and have a total sum of biological value of a site. We could average across species for that site. But one way that may be most useful, I think, is to do a weighted value where some species may be more concerning than others. So if we have species that are priority 1 in Alabama and species that are priority 2 in Alabama, we may give more weight to species that are priority 1 because they are more imperiled than species that are priority 2 in the state of Alabama. So we can weight these species by relative importance. The biological or conservation value of site I is equal to the sum of the weighted values of each site for each species. Excuse me. So this is a simple advance on incorporating multiple species into an assessment. Now, taking that same concept, it's not too complicated to add in additional objectives and additional considerations. So, for example, spatial proximity to urban land cover might reduce the value of a parcel because land values closer to urban, or the more urban you have in a particular area, land purchase values may be higher. It may be harder to acquire those patches, but they also may have higher restrictions on what kind of management actions that you can do. So if you have a patch of potential grassland that is surrounded by urban land cover, residential homes, you may not have the freedom to burn those patches. You may not have the freedom to graze those patches. So that could limit the value of that patch. So what we can do then is take our original summed weighted value of a patch as biological value and constrain that value by the proportion of urban land cover in a landscape. So then your R sub I, the reward or the value of a particular patch, is equal to the weighted sum of your species value at each site minus 1 times the proportion of urban land cover in that landscape. So this discounts any patches that are surrounded by lots of urban in that landscape. Further steps could be taken to incorporate cost, where if we had I conceived of 2 different ways of conceiving cost in a project like this, one where we would minimize cost, in which case your overall reward of a particular patch I would be, again, the sum of the weighted rewards, biological rewards for that patch, minus your urban land cover effect, minus the parcel cost of a given patch. And so this would be, you would then select the set of patches that would give you the most reward, where cost of patches is subtracted out of the biological benefit of those locations. Another way to conceive this is sometimes in resource management we don't have a simple minimization of cost. We have budgets that we have to spend. Oftentimes we try to spend up to our limit of budget and no more. And so maybe we would have a simple modification of our reward function where the reward of a site was simply Z times the biological reward times the urban discount effect, where Z is 1 if the sum of your parcel costs is less than the budget, less than or equal to the budget, and it's 0 if you exceed that budget, so that anytime the set of parcels that you want to target exceeds your budget, this becomes 0, and then the whole value of that site or that set of patches is devalued. So that's basically the framework and the basic concepts of how we would propose modeling the system and then valuing the various habitat conversion actions that you may or may not take in a specific landscape through the marginal value, and then discounting that marginal value by your other objectives and your other considerations in that system. So with that, we walked through an example of how this might be applied with 2 species under consideration, though expanding this to 4, 5, 6 species is not a problem. You're only limited by the number of species that you have good empirical data for and good underlying occupancy models for. And then we applied this example assessment to 5 counties in the Black Belt region here in central Alabama. You can see here's the Mobile Bay. There's probably Montgomery is somewhere right about there. So this is somewhere in west central Alabama that we're doing as an example. And so the first step in our process is to map all the land cover types in that region and get a baseline understanding of what actual habitat types are out there. And then we can exclude things that aren't part of our assessments and just focus in on the habitat types of interest: row crops, urban, hay, pasture, grassland. I only put 4 up here just for explanation, but given some of the covariates that we had in our small mammal modeling, you'd have to also include some of the forest cover types here. And then we used 2 example species. As I said, we focused on dickcissel occupancy since we had good data and good models from the first JV-sponsored study that we did with that. And our first step is to calculate or estimate the occupancy of this 5-county region for dickcissel. So find the probable occupancy at all the habitat types in the landscape. And then we also chose the old field mouse as our second species here. And we did that acknowledging that old field mouse, we didn't have great data or great model convergence and model selection for, but we wanted to exemplify that 2 species that were grassland-associated species but had very different occupancy modeling outcomes could be incorporated into this system effectively. So again, while I acknowledge that the results of the empirical study were frustratingly limited in our inferential capacity, we still felt that they were useful for demonstrating how this approach might work in the case of the example that we presented in our work. And so the second step is then to assess the occupancy old field mice throughout the region that we're exemplifying here. The next step is to independently calculate the direct value of those sites. So that is the direct value of converting a specific site into a grassland patch from an ag patch for each species. And so on the left here we see that we'd get high value or high direct value at sites like this for Dixisel. The old field mouse had fewer sites that exhibited high value, but basically what we're doing here is avoiding places with woody wetlands in the landscape. And just to note that this is actually just to have an easily a map that we could study relatively easily. We just took a small portion of that 5-county area to show in these direct value calculations. So then the next step is to do the indirect value calculations for those landscapes for each species independently. And these are what your two maps would look like for, again, that subset of these 5 counties. And then the last step is to combine those two species by weighting them. And in this case, we weighted them equally because we didn't have any indication from as to whether one was more valuable than the other. But so we weighted them equally and summed their biological value to the system, and then we discounted by the proximity or the proportion, the proportion of urban in that landscape. And so this would be your final map of valuable locations to restore grassland habitat in this 5-county area. So just keeping in mind that the red, the bright red here are the urban patches, and then the maroon or dark brown areas, which are hard to see, would be the areas of high value. Pink and blue would be areas of relatively low value, and then white would have no value. And so that's total restoration value for the 2 species of grassland-associated vertebrates, considering that areas with lots of urban habitat in the area are discounted because of the difficulty of working there and the likely prices of those parcels. So I totally skipped over our second question in our for the panel reviewers, but I think that both of them could be asked here at the end in succession. So the second question was supposed to be about the budgets and how cost might be incorporated into decisions that managers might be making, and then the last question was about the utility of this kind of approach to the decision makers and managers out there. So I'll turn it over to Toby for that.
I have the first question. How do your habitat management decisions typically incorporate cost launched right now? We've got close to 50% of the vote coming in. I'm going to close it in a few seconds. It seems like when I close the poll, that's what happens to your presentation there, but I do have the results of the poll show that 10% of the folks say they spend as much as possible of their yearly maximum budget. 70%, by far the winner, say that they try to minimize annual cost and maximize conservation benefit, while 20% say they try to minimize multi-year cost and maximize benefit.
Excellent.
And now I'm going to launch the last question that we have for you. This is very useful feedback for us, so we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. The last question is, to what extent do you view the marginal gain occupancy model as relevant to your conservation work? And in the meantime, while people are voting or answering the question, I want to encourage you to also think about if you have any questions for the presenter. You could type those into the chat box. Or if we don't have a lot of questions, we could even just have you raise your hand and we could unmute you so that you could ask your question directly. We have 50% of the folks have voted. I'm going to wait a few more seconds. So I'm closing the poll, and the results show that, let's see, we have by far the most popular answer. 64% voted the model would be somewhat relevant, but the capacity or ability to use the model is limited. And then the next highest response was, it's very relevant, but the capacity is limited. And 9% said it was very relevant and the model is immediately applicable.